right here on YouTube, and then we will get started. I hope everyone's having a good Monday so far. And tonight we're going to have, I think it's going to end up being a fairly short session because we are taking, we've been really going pretty hams on particularly German beers, but also lagers and one or two ales thrown in there. So tonight we only have about 6 styles to talk through. And then next week, we are going to finish up with our first chunk. Again, our first half of the beer styles. And so then in 2 weeks, we're going to have a review session to cover everything we've talked about in the first 6 weeks of the training. And I'll have more information for you on how you can submit questions. But as you have questions in the meantime, feel free to put those in the submit a question form in the members area of the website. And if you would like for that, for whatever your question is, to wait for 2 weeks when we're doing a group review, that's totally fine. I'll probably get a form set up for all of you as well. So be on the lookout for directions for that in probably this week's email that's going to go out on Wednesday or Thursday. And before I forget, one of the other things I wanted to remind all of you, or if you haven't seen the email, that the Bjcp calendared a whole slew of beer tasting exams for the fall. So those have been updated through December on the events calendar in the members area of the website as well. I do have 2 exams that I will be administering. One of them is in Charlotte in September. That one is actually already full. It reached capacity very quickly. But if you're interested in being on the wait list for that exam, please go ahead and email me and let me know. And then I also have an exam I will be administering in Atlanta, Georgia on October 2nd. That's a Saturday. And I'm about halfway full for that one. So if you're interested, or if you think you might be interested in registering for that exam in Atlanta, please go ahead and email me. If we need to adjust your registration at a later date, we can certainly do that. But that way, you have a seat, and it just happens to line up with about the end of these training classes or training sessions that we're doing each week. So you will be well prepared for any of the exams you see starting in August all the way through the end of the year. So if you haven't taken a moment to check that event calendar, please take a couple minutes sometime this week to see if there have been any exams added near you, and go ahead and get registered for them. Just, Band-Aid method, write off, email that exam administrator, ask for a seat, and let's really do this. Let's get some women taking the Bjcp tasting exam and becoming registered Bjcp judges. So as a reminder, if you have any questions tonight, go ahead and put those in the Q&A for me. My moderator, who is usually in the chat with you all, isn't able to attend tonight. So I'm not very good at being able to keep an eye on both the chat and the Q&A. So as you have questions, put those in the Q&A for me, and let's get started. So I'm going to pull my slides over here. And like I said, we're coming up really on the end of kind of going through a lot of the German beer styles. And once we get through our review, we'll move on to English, or I should say British and Irish beer styles. So okay, somehow I have managed to add myself as a panelist instead of the host, but I've got it. I can still manage that. All right, so you all should hopefully be able to see my screen. And tonight we're going to be talking about amber malty and amber bitter European lager. As you'll recall, last week we started out with pale malty and pale bitter European lagers. So we're really going to round that out tonight. And like I said, we only have 6 styles to talk through tonight. I guess technically 7 styles, because there's 2 sub styles that we'll talk about at the end. So Again, like with last week, what you're going to see is a lot of repetition because we're talking about beer styles from the same part of the world that are going to be using the same basic base ingredients. And these are all going to be lagers that we're talking about tonight. So you'll see a lot of clean lager fermentation character for what to expect in terms of fermentation. So again, I think it's helpful though to see that repetition because I know for me, it helps me remember, okay, if I'm talking about a Mercen, it's amber malty European lager, that already gives me a lot of information about, where I should be thinking. And particularly for those of you who are taking this course as a way to help you prepare for your Cicerone exam, any level, but particularly certified Cicerone, a lot of the questions you get for beer styles may ask you something like, what is a style that is an amber malty lager with smoked flavor? And if you're familiar with your BJCP style categories and your sub styles, that really points you right down to the answer. So the styles we're going to talk about tonight are Mercen, Brauch beer, Dunkelsbach, Vienna Lager, alt beer, and then we're going to wrap up with Keller beer. And within Keller beer, we're going to talk about pale Keller beer and amber Keller beer. And I'm already sick of saying Keller beer. I will be definitely sick of it by the time we're finished. But Keller beer, we'll talk about it when we get there. But that's kind of an interesting, we'll call it an interesting editorial decision that the BJCP made with Keller beer. So as always, I like to show you a picture of your BJCP score sheets. When I'm talking through these slides and this information, I've really tried to structure it so that we're basically filling out that score sheet from the top down. So just as a reminder, if you're judging someplace like a competition, you will have the score sheet on the left where you will have all of the descriptors of off flavors. When you're going in for your BJCP beer judging exam, you will have that exam score sheet. So the right-hand side will look exactly the same, but rather than have all of those flavor descriptions, you will just have the check boxes to fill out. So when we're talking about amber malty European lager, when I'm trying to put together like an overview slide, particularly for these two styles we're talking about tonight, the BJCP guidelines are like, it's amber colored, is a lager. And so there's not a whole lot to flesh out. The title says what it is, but these are going to be amber colored, German origin, bottom fermented lagers with a malty balance. And they're going to be Vollbier to stark beer in strength. And you might remember last week, we talked a little bit about Vollbier and stark beer. These aren't things that you're going to need to know for your BJCP exam, for your Cicerone exam, but just in terms of being, a beer enthusiast and learning more about the styles, I do like to include this information here. So that way, I personally don't like to read words and not dive into what they mean if they're unfamiliar to me. So I like to include these here. Vollbier is also known as full or entire beer. This is going to be all beers with an original gravity of 1044 to 1057, or in degrees Plato is going to be 11 to 14 degrees Plato. Stark beer is strong beer. So that's going to be all beers with an original gravity of more than 1065 or 16 degrees Plato. And again, and I know I mentioned this last week when we're talking about Vollbier, stark beer, I also like to include it because it's a good reminder that, beer styles are a construct. They're a consensus that changes over time. And within the United States, within specifically United States beer judging, a lot of people will use the BJCP guidelines, but it's not a law, it's not a regulation written down anywhere. And if you go someplace like Germany, you'll be much more likely to see something like Vollbier or stark beer. So I also like to include these as a reminder that different countries are going to have different naming conventions, and one isn't better than the other, or, one's not more enforceable than the other. Although I guess technically in the case of Germany, they do have some pretty enforceable beer laws, but I digress. So let's start out talking about Mercen. And again, with these slides, the very first slide we have for each style, this is going to come directly from the BJCP guidelines. So our overall impression is an elegant, malty German amber lager with a clean, rich, toasty, and bready malt flavor, restrained bitterness, and a dry finish that encourages another drink. So you may remember last week we talked about Fest beer. So Fest beer and Mercen are very closely related, and a lot of times people will use Oktoberfest for one or the other, and that's, for the most part, that's correct. A Mercen is going to be a darker version of a Fest beer, and the actually, if you even look at the stats, so the ABV range, and the IBU range for Fest beer and Mercen are exactly the same. The only difference is going to be the color, and then of course, with the darker color, with those deeper colored malts, you're going to have a little bit more richness and toastiness than you would with a Fest beer. So when we're talking about our score sheet, we've got our malt is going to be moderate, again, keeping in mind that we have, these are all amber malty beers, so they're all going to be very malt forward. We're going to have, again, looking for rich, bready, somewhat toasty, maybe a little bit of a light bread crust. These, when we're getting into these styles, this is where you're starting to see more of what is actually inappropriate. So caramel, dry biscuity, or roasted malt aromas are inappropriate for a Mercen. And again, I feel like I may have touched on this last week as well, but particularly with German styles, particularly with German lager styles, they have a fairly simple recipe. And that's, the differences are going to be with a lot of the technique, and there are a lot of ways to create kind of that toasty malt forward character. There's a lot of ways to create the color that you will find in a beer, but there's really only like one or two correct ways to do it. So it is important to pay attention, particularly with styles like this, about what kinds of flavors are inappropriate, because you could very well use just a little bit of roasted malt to get that color in your Mercen, and it's going to be inappropriate. So there's only a couple of right ways to make a beer like a Mercen. There's a lot of wrong ways. So again, since we're talking about malt forward beers, what we're going to see in these three beers that we're talking about in this category, we're not going to expect any kind of hop aroma. Again, we've got our friend clean lager fermentation. You may see a little bit of a very, very light alcohol, but that shouldn't be sharp, because again, going back to our ABV at the highest, a Mercen is going to be about 6.3%, which is really not very high at all in terms of ABV. So if you get a very light alcohol, that's fine. Don't expect one. And if you find yourself in the territory of wondering whether the alcohol burn you're getting is too high or too much, it probably is. So when we're talking about appearance, this is another important one. This is how this is the difference between a Fest beer and a Mercen. It's really going to be in the color. So we want an amber orange to deep reddish copper. It should not be golden. If it's golden, it's a Fest beer. I really wish I said that like I was going to rhyme, and if it's golden, it's a Fest beer. We're going to expect bright clarity and a persistent off-white head. Again, our flavor is going to be very similar to our aroma, distinct and complex maltiness that often includes a bready, toasty aspect. Noticeable caramel, biscuit, or roasted flavors are inappropriate always. So that's a full stop. So if you're someplace and you're judging a beer and they say that it's a Mercen, a German Mercen, and you take a sip of it and you get roasted flavors, that's going to be a big ding. That beer is not to style. Moderate bitterness, again, the bitterness is really just going to be there to support that malt flavor, and we don't want it to be, it's going to be a somewhat dry finish. It's going to be an elegant finish. We don't want it to be sweet or cloying. So we need just enough bitterness there to kind of balance that out. Our hops are going to be none to low, and as we have seen for the past couple of weeks, floral, herbal, or spicy. Those are going to be the main flavor characteristics for our noble hops, for our German hops. So you would expect for, for I think every German beer we're talking about for the next, or for these few weeks, you're going to expect a floral, herbal, or spicy hop flavor. Clean lager fermentation, a malt finish with the same elegant rich malt flavors from the flavor and the aroma is going to be lingering on your palate. Medium body, medium carbonation. Again, you may see some slight warming, but the strength should really be hidden. And, we're talking about at most a 6.3% beer. So you wouldn't really be expecting, a lot of alcohol warmth from that. Because again, with our fest beer, the same with the Munich Helles, these are beers that are designed to be, enjoyed throughout the day, enjoyed someplace like Oktoberfest, where you've got the big Maßkrug liter of them and you're drinking them throughout the day. So next we have Rauch beer. If you've been around me for more than 5 minutes, you know how much I love smoked beer, and Rauch beer is really the OG of smoked beer. So there are a couple of very important distinctions to make with a Rauch beer. But first, our overall impression. This is going to be an elegant, malty German amber lager with a balanced, complementary beechwood smoke character. And again, with the stats, don't worry too much about them. Just have a fairly good understanding of, is this going to be a mid ABV? We're in the amber malty, so your IBUs are going to be fairly low, more on the balancing side. So with Rauch beer, with the main characteristic is going to be this smoke flavor, specifically beechwood smoke. So when we're talking about a true German Rauch beer, it's going to be a Mercen base. So we just talked about all of the flavors that we would expect from a Mercen, and it's going to have the addition of beechwood smoked malt. So if it is not beechwood smoked malt, it is not a Rauch beer. It can still be a smoked beer, but it is not a Rauch beer per the Rauch beer style. Hopefully that distinction isn't too very confusing, but just know with Rauch beer, it has to be beechwood smoke. Some people will just describe all smoked beer as a Rauch beer. Technically that's incorrect, but again, the style guideline police aren't going to show up and fine anybody for doing that. So when we're talking about the aroma, again, what we should be smelling is the beechwood smoke character, but it can be smoky, obviously. It can be woody. It can be very bacon-like. A lot of people, the first time they have a Rauch beer, particularly something like Schlinklerla, which is the kind of the iconic Rauch beer, will say this tastes like liquid bacon. You also want that clean lager fermentation, none to very low for your hops. Again, if you can get anything, it's going to be those German hop aromas. So floral, spicy, or herbal, but it should be very, very low. You really shouldn't be getting a lot of hop aroma out of a Rauch beer at all. The smoke should be the star of the show, but elegantly balanced with that kind of those Mercen, bready, toasty malt aromas. Our color is going to be medium amber to / light copper to dark brown, very clear clarity, and a persistent tan to cream, creamy head. So our flavor, again, the beechwood smoke, it can be low to high, but it should be prominent. You should be able to notice it, and you should be able to notice it in enough of a level that you're not wondering if you're tasting smoke. You should know that you're tasting smoke. When we're talking about a smoked beer, and this is true for all smoked beers, harsh, bitter, burnt, charred, rubbery, sulfury, phenolic, all of those smoky characteristics are absolutely inappropriate. As a smoked beer lover, I get very, I don't know if angry is really the right word, but I guess I'm not mad, I'm disappointed when somebody makes a smoked beer and uses that really, uses a really burnt, rubbery, phenolic, smoked malt character, because a lot of people find that off-putting. Those aren't good flavors. And that might be the first smoked beer you ever taste, and it ends up being the last smoked beer you ever taste because those smoked flavors aren't correct. They're not to style, and they're also not very appetizing. So you don't try another smoked beer because your first experience with smoked beer was a terrible one. I will get off my smoked beer soapbox when we're talking about flavor beyond the smoke. Again, think about that Mercen base. So it's a Mercen beer with beechwood smoke character added to it. So it's going to be malty, toasty. You're going to have a little bit of bread crust. Again, all of the rules that apply for a Mercen will apply here. So caramel, dry biscuity, roasted malt, those are all inappropriate flavors in a Rauch beer. Our bitterness, moderate and balanced, is going to be there to make sure that our malt flavor and the smoke flavor isn't going to be cloying or really overpowering. If you're getting any kind of hop flavor, it should be no more than moderate. Spicy, floral, or herbal, clean lager fermentation. You would expect a medium dry to dry finish. And again, your finish should be a nice balance of the malt characteristics as well as the smoked flavors. And when we're talking about a nice balance there, what we really mean is that you can have a little bit of smoke and more malt flavor, or you can have a lot of smoke and less malt flavor. As long as those two work together, you can really have any kind of balance, in between that spectrum. Our body is going to be medium carbonation, medium high. Significant astringent phenolic harshness is inappropriate. So again, if you've got very phenolic or astringent kinds of smoked malts that you're using, which is not technically correct, that's going to be, mouthfeel like a huge ding if you get that astringent phenolic harshness. And then it should be smooth. It's a lager. It has those nice malt, nice darker malts in it. So you should expect a smooth character from it. So then the last one in this category we're going to talk about is Dunkelsbach. This is a strong, dark, malty German lager that emphasizes the malty rich and somewhat toasty qualities of continental malts without being sweet in the finish. So it's going to be very similar to the other two beers that we just discussed, no smoked malt, obviously. And actually I have a funny story about continental malts. I know what continental means, but the first time I was taking the certified Cicerone exam, I was super nervous. And one of the beer style questions asked about, I believe it was actually Vienna Lager, but it said something about this is, an amber lager, like not German, from continental Europe. And my mind went blank on what continental meant. I knew what it meant, but I could not think of any country outside of Germany that was on the European continent. And I think I finally answered Irish red ale, but made a little note to say, I know that Ireland isn't continental Europe, but that's the best I could think of. And I'm sure I did not get partial credit for acknowledging that I was not correct about what continental meant. So anyway, Dunkelsbach. With the malts, since we're talking again about amber malty beers, it's going to be malt forward, medium to medium high, bready, malty, rich. You will have moderate amounts of rich Maillard products and or toasty overtones. So again, when we're talking about Maillard products, I watched a webinar one time about kilning malts, and the presenter said, and then you get Maillard reactions, and that's just magic. With Maillard products, what we're really talking about are those browning reactions. So if you're thinking about baking bread, or baking bread is really all I can think of. But as the bread bakes, or as you're roasting something, those colors get darker, right? And as the colors get darker, you get more of those darker kind of Maillard products. So when we're talking about Maillard products, that's what we're talking about. You may get a dark fruit character from the malt, particularly in older examples. So this is really the first time I believe that we've seen where our malt that we're using is going to give us a dark fruit character. And when we're talking about dark fruit character, what that's really going to be is things like plums, prunes, raisins, cherries, that kind of dark fruit. And we'll see that more particularly as we get into the Belgian style ales. But just know if you're having a Dunkelsbach and you get, a little bit of that, and so it'll be a very low if you get any at all. But if you get a low dark fruit flavor, chances are it's going to be from the malt rather than from the fermentation, rather than from the yeast, because of course a Dunkelsbach is going to be a lager. So we would expect a clean lager fermentation character to it. Hops for the aroma, virtually none. We're talking about malt forward beers, light copper to brown, often with garnet highlights, good clarity, persistent off-white, large and creamy head. Our flavor, again, complex, rich maltiness. This is going to be a German malt showcase. It's going to be dominated by those toasty, rich Maillard products. So think about bread crust, think about toast. You may get some caramel, but you shouldn't have roasted malts in a Dunkelsbach. So you shouldn't expect any kind of roasted or burnt character. And again, that's really kind of recipe, I would say recipe building like 201 is understanding when you should expect to have, or when you should expect to use something like roasted malt to get the color and flavor versus using, maybe a couple of different kinds of Munich malts or layering together, your flavors, having a longer boil, things like that. So with bitterness, high enough to support the malt flavors, that's it. You shouldn't have any hop character from that as well. We want a clean fermentation character and it should be well attenuated. So again, not cloying. Your bitterness, your fermentation, everything should come together to really showcase that malt. Medium to medium full body, moderately low to moderate carbonation. You may have some warmth, but it should never be hot. No astringency, and you would expect, again, those smooth palate sensations. So I think that puts us at the end of, so we're going to move to the amber bitter European lager. If anyone has any questions about what we were just talking about, go ahead and pop those into the Q&A now. And if not, I will go ahead and move forward with our amber bitter European lager. Again, this is a really boring overview because the name really tells you everything. Amber colored beers of German or Austrian origin. You would expect it to be evenly balanced or bitter balanced. So another thing to understand is when we're talking about pale bitter European lagers, amber bitter European lagers, the term bitter isn't the same as, particularly in the United States, when we think about bitter beers, we think about, or I know I personally think about, what American IPAs were 10 years ago, when it was kind of this race to see who could make the most bitter beer. When we're talking about something like a bitter lager, a bitter German or Austrian lager, we're not talking about that the same way. It's going to be balanced, as in not malt forward, or it's going to be balanced a little bit more towards the bitter side. So I think that's an important distinction to make as you're learning about the beer styles, is that things like bitter are going to mean different things with different beer styles and different brewing philosophies. So with Vienna Lager, from the continent of Europe, a moderate strength amber lager with a soft, smooth maltiness and a moderate bitterness, yet finishing relatively dry. So again, with all of our lagers, since we do have that lager yeast, they're going to ferment a little bit more of the sugars than an ale yeast will, which is why lagers are described as being crisp or finishing dry, because they eat just a little bit more of those sugars. So the final product is going to end up being a nice dry finish. So with our aroma, it's going to be moderately intense, toasty, and malty rich. Again, significant caramel or roasted aroma is inappropriate. So a fun story about Vienna Lager, it might sound very similar to Mercen, and that's because the two dudes who invented both of these beer styles, or I shouldn't say invented, but popularized both beer styles, were really good friends who ended up going on meeting while they were both doing a brewing tour of Europe to learn how to be better brewers, and decided to travel together. And so when they were in the UK, they learned things like how to, they learned like new malting techniques, because at the time, English brewing was very much at the forefront of brewing innovation and adopting new techniques. So they learned a lot of malting techniques. So specifically, outside of brewing, malting innovation was England was really leading the way on that. So when they returned back to Bavaria and to Vienna, they really kind of developed these different styles of higher kilned malts kind of concurrently. So that's why we have Munich malt and Vienna malt. They're very similar. Mercen and Vienna Lager are very similar styles. The difference being, or one of the differences being, of course, the Vienna Lager is made with Vienna malt, but it's also going to be a little more bitter balanced, whereas your Mercen is going to have Munich malt and is going to be a little bit sweeter. But they're very similar because they were invented by besties around the same time. With hops, none to low. If they're there, you would expect floral or spicy, clean lager fermentation character, light reddish amber to copper, bright clarity with persistent off-white, very large head. Flavor is going to be soft, elegant malt complexity in the forefront. We're also going to get that rich toasty character. Again, no significant caramel or roast character. When we're talking about things like Munich malt, Vienna malt, those can be used as base malts, and they're going to be higher kilned, so kilned a little bit longer to have those Maillard products developed a little bit more. And that's where we're getting those toasty, rich character from, rather than the use of caramel or roasted malt. Bitterness is going to be none to low, again, floral and or spicy if it's present, clean lager fermentation, fairly dry and crisp finish with both rich malt and hop bitterness present in the aftertaste. So again, Vienna Lager is going to be one of those balanced, evenly balanced beers, medium light to medium body, moderate carbonation, gentle creaminess, and smooth character. So next we have alt beer. Alt beer is a well-balanced, well-attenuated, bitter, yet malty, clean and smooth, amber to copper-colored German beer. So something that's super interesting about alt beer is that alt beer is one of the few examples of an ale, a German ale. So it's going to be I'm trying to make sure I get this correct. This is a bottom fermenting ale beer. And if you want another very good, very fun sensory experiment to learn your beer styles and really learn the difference between a lager fermentation and an ale fermentation, is do a side-by-side with an alt beer and a California Common, because a California Common is a top fermenting lager, whereas alt beer is a bottom fermenting ale. And they are super, super similar in almost all of their characteristics. So color-wise, flavor-wise, but doing a side-by-side is a really great way to kind of train your palate to pick up on the characteristics of an ale yeast and the characteristics of a lager yeast. So alt beer, California Common, great example to sit down and do a side-by-side with. Like if you really want to be mean to yourself, do it blind, or maybe not. I mean, you have a 50-50 chance of being, feeling like really cool that you were able to just smell and tell and taste and tell the difference. But those are two styles that are super similar that I always like to recommend people do as a side-by-side. And then just one more brief aside, I'm sure it won't be the last one, but I once met a gentleman who, that also sounded like I was starting a limerick. I'm not. But he said his favorite beer was an alt beer, and man, did he hate California Commons. And that was just such an odd distinction to say, this beer style is my very favorite beer style, and this beer style I hate. This is the worst beer style because they're so, so similar. Anyway, back to talking about the appearance of alt beer. Oh, and then so the last statement that I will make about the aroma is that you will expect to find esters, since this is an ale yeast fermentation. You'll have low to medium low fruity esters. With your appearance, light amber to deep copper, but bronze orange is the most common. Again, if you get a light amber or deep copper or anywhere in between, that's not a fault, but bronze orange is the most common. And we see that also with styles like Saison, where the bright orange color is kind of a hallmark of the style, but it's not incorrect if it's still within those style guidelines. Brilliant clarity, long-lasting off-white, thick and creamy head. So with our flavors, clean and crisp, rich and complex. You're going to still get somewhat grainy flavors, which again is an interesting note if you taste it side by side with the California Common, because the California Common will also have that American like churro base malt, kind of that grainy huskiness. So that's another similarity the two of them have, although an alt beer is going to be brewed typically with German malts. No roasted malt flavors or harshness. Again, roasted flavors, caramel flavors. In something like a German alt beer, you're not using, and you shouldn't be using caramel or roasted malts anyway in the recipe. It's just going to be those nice German base malts. The bitterness is going to be assertive. The hop flavor is going to be low to moderate, so spicy, peppery, or floral. Again, our classic German hops. Alt beer is a more bitter, balanced beer, but it's still not going to be like bitter as in like American IPA or double IPA bitterness. We would expect some fruity esters with an alt beer specifically. This is going to be cherry-like. So another great experiment if you're wanting to learn the difference between, dark fruit flavors of a Dunkelsbach from the malt, or fruity esters like dark fruit like cherries from fermentation. Do a Dunkelsbach and an alt beer side by side, and that would definitely help you learn the differences between the two, because I know that's a question I get commonly, is if something is or let's go with dark fruit again, or berries, that the berry flavor can come from your malt, it can come from your hops, it can come from your yeast, and it's really taking practice to learn where and how those berry kind of characteristics show up within each one of the ingredients. So the more you practice it and the more that you're, kind of picking the beer apart and kind of getting all of the components before putting it back together again, the easier it becomes to smell something and say, oh, this is cherry-like ester from fermentation versus this is dark cherry from the use of darker malts. So our finish and aftertaste is long lasting, medium dry to dry, bittersweet or nutty finish that reflects both the hop bitterness and the malt complexity. So again, bitter balanced, not firmly in the bitter territory. You might also get a light sulfury or minerally character. Again, that's going to be optional. That's going to be mainly from your water, which is going to be a kind of a hallmark, or like a calling card of the origin of the alt beer style, which is Dusseldorf. That's going to be the water source there is going to have that slightly sulfury minerally character. But if you're drinking an alt beer and you don't pick that up, it's not a fault. If it's there, it's also not a fault. Medium bodied, medium to medium high carbonation, you shouldn't expect any kind of astringency. So then the last style we're going to talk about is Keller Beer. And Keller Beer literally means cellar beer, which implies beer served straight from the lagering cellar. So, and we'll talk about pale Keller Beer and amber Keller Beer both tonight, and you'll see that they both more or less have base styles that go with them. But it's going to be young, unfiltered, unpasteurized versions of traditional German beer styles, traditionally served on tap from the lagering vessel. So that's an important distinction to make. You may sometimes see it as Naturtrüb, which means naturally cloudy. You may recall last week, if you were reading through the German wheat beers, there were several of the Weiss beers and Dunkel beers that had Naturtrüb in the name. That just means that they're naturally cloudy. Sometimes also called Zwickel beer. So if you see Keller Beer, Zwickel beer, they're talking about the same thing. This is the name of the tap used to sample from a lagering tank. So if you've been in a brew house before, you've got the little valve, the tap that's on the lagering tank, that's known as a Zwickel, which is why it's known as a Zwickel beer. So this, again, like I mentioned, is kind of an interesting editorial decision I think that the Bjcp made. I don't agree or disagree. I just think it's interesting that Keller Beer is more of a serving style than a beer style. So it's almost kind of like if you had a beer style that was called bottle conditioned. It's not exactly like that, but kind of in the same, we're talking about serving style rather than an actual beer style, but the justification the BJCP has for it is the serving technique is predominantly used with certain styles. But I really wouldn't be surprised once there is an update to the BJCP guidelines to see if maybe Keller Beer gets shuffled into some other style or sub style, since it is more of a serving style rather than a brewing technique or a beer style. But the first one we're going to talk about is pale Keller Beer. So pale Keller Beer is going to be a young Helles, so young fresh Helles. So it's going to be malty, fully attenuated Pils malt showcase. The hop character is going to be more pronounced than a traditional Helles, and the beer is going to be cloudy because we're serving it off the tap. Often with some level of diacetyl, and possibly has some green apple and or other yeast derived notes. So something like a pale Keller Beer is, again, since it's going to be young and fresh, fermentation may not have quite finished, which is why we have some of those fermentation flavors such as green apple, diacetyl, and other kinds of yeast derived notes. These are also typically the commercial examples I have listed here are available as bottled versions, but they are typically going to be like, again, is a serving style. So you would see these mostly if you're in person, in the spot where they're serving off the tap. That's where you're really going to see a Keller Beer, particularly with something like pale Keller Beer, amber Keller Beer. They're meant to be very young versions, so they don't really do well as bottled or packaged versions. So pale Keller Beer, again, thinking back to Helles, like we talked about last week, pleasant, grainy, sweet, and clean. You may have a low amount of DMS, moderately low to moderately high, spicy, floral, or herbal. Our fermentation, we're still talking about a lager fermentation, but again, since it's young, we're going to have very low to moderate diacetyl, which would not be a fault. So this is one of those styles, where you can have actually up to moderate diacetyl is going to be quite a bit of diacetyl than what you would normally see, hopefully, when you're judging. Possibly very low green apple or other yeast derived notes. The appearance is going to be medium yellow to pale gold, slight haze to moderately cloudy, again, because we're serving off of the tank. Good persistent head, white and creamy. So our flavor is going to be much the same as the aroma, moderate, rounded, grainy, sweet, low background note of DMS. You're going to have moderate bitterness that can linger, low to moderately high, spicy, floral, or herbal. Very low to moderate diacetyl. Again, this is one of those styles. We'll learn more about this when we get to British beer styles. That sometimes a low level of diacetyl is kind of adds to the experience. Too much and it's going to be undrinkable, but if you have diacetyl in something like a pale Keller Beer, it's not necessarily a fault. Well, it's not a fault because, again, we're dealing with a young beer where maybe fermentation hasn't quite finished. Very low green apple or other yeast derived notes are possible. Your finish is going to be crisp and dry, but the aftertaste should remain malty because, again, we're talking more about a Munich Helles that's just very young, so it's going to be a malt forward beer. Medium body, low to medium carbonation. It's straight off the tap. It's probably not carbonated yet. You may get a slight slickness on the tongue from the diacetyl, but it shouldn't be slickness on the tongue from diacetyl. Not everybody picks up on that, but if you do pick up on it, it's not a fault. So with our amber Keller Beer, this is going to be a young, unfiltered, and unpasteurized beer that's somewhere between a Helles and a Mercen in color. It's going to be spicier in the hops, spicier than a Helles or a Mercen, typically with greater attenuation. And again, the commercial examples I have listed here, these are all packaged versions. The most authentic versions are going to be obviously straight from the tap because we're talking more about a serving style. The aroma, so we're thinking more towards a Mercen. We're going to have moderately intense malt aroma, typically rich, bready, somewhat toasty, light bread crust notes, just like a Mercen, caramel, biscuity, roasted malt. Any of those are going to be inappropriate. Moderately low to moderate hop aroma is going to be spicy or peppery, probably not so much floral for this style. Very low to low diacetyl, and occasionally low to moderately low sulfur, very low green apple or other yeast-derived notes. The same as the pale Keller beer, we're going to have some fermentation flavors still present in that beer. Gold to deep reddish amber, moderately cloudy to clear, depending on how old it is, off-white head color, and creamy head texture. So with the flavor, distinct and complex, again, we're talking about very similar to a Mercen style. You'll have that bready, toasty aspect, noticeable caramel or roasted malt flavors, inappropriate. Moderate to moderately high bitterness, low to moderately high spicy or herbal hop character. So again, if you have a beer that says that it's an amber Keller beer and you're getting a floral hop character or a citrus hop character, that's going to be inappropriate. You're looking for spicy or herbal. Very low to low diacetyl, very low green apple, other yeast-derived notes are possible. So again, possible doesn't mean mandatory. If you have an amber Keller beer and you're not picking up on that low diacetyl, low green apple, any kind of like sulfur, anything else is going to be yeast derived. That's not a fault, but it's also not a fault if you pick it up in low doses. The balance can be either the malt side or the hop side, and the finish is going to be moderately dry to dry. Specifically, it's going to not be sweet because we should still have full attenuation on that. And it may be slightly bitter. You would still, though, expect that smooth, malty aftertaste because we are talking about a malt-forward beer. A mouthfeel is medium, carbonation is medium, and there's going to be a creamy texture. So that is the end of the slides I have to share with you tonight. And I see we have a few questions. All right, do you have suggestions for sensory exercises on wood smoke? I have no idea what beechwood smells and tastes like. I think this is a really great question. I have a couple of suggestions for you. The first is with something like beechwood smoke. If you go into your homebrew store and they have smoked malt, chances are it's going to be beechwood smoked malt. So you can either kind of like take a big whiff of that, eat a few kernels there, or grab some to take home and do something like a hot steep with. Most homebrew stores I've seen will have beechwood smoked malt or peat smoked malt. Do not ever use peat smoked malt in a beer. I will come and arrest you. That something like peat smoked malt is meant for distilling only. So that's one way that you could do sensory exercises on wood smoke is just, grab some from your homebrew store. I can almost guarantee that if they have smoked malt in stock, it's going to be beechwood smoked malt. Otherwise, I would recommend getting something like a Schlenkerla. If you go into, any bottle shop that has a fairly good import or import section, they're going to have Schlenkerla. That's kind of the gold standard for what a Rauch beer, traditional Rauch beer, it tastes like. And so I would recommend getting one of those. Also, it's one of my very favorite beers, but that will give you the idea of what beechwood smoke is. So that was a very good answer. Is Keller beer different than beer that's just served straight from a bright tank? Cindy, if you're asking me, I don't necessarily think so. I think you can make an argument either way. I know a lot of times, particularly in the States, like I know when I worked at Pilot Brewing in Charlotte, we had some beers that were served straight from the bright. That's not exactly the same thing as a Keller beer, where something like a Keller beer is going to be like the Zwickel tap is actually just like a little tap, the little guy that you can just get some of the beer out at a time. It's not exactly the same as serving it like straight from the bright, but I think I also might be making a distinction without a difference. So yeah, that's a good question. Let me think about that. But I would say it depends, but I don't have a great answer for you on that. But I think that your mind is in the right spot. I think Negro Modelo calls itself a Munich style, but is listed as a Vienna Lager, in example in the BJCP. Thoughts? Do we go with the BJCP in cases where information disagrees? So this is also a super great point to make, because a lot of particularly like Mexican amber lagers are Vienna lagers. And the reason for that was, I don't remember exactly what the date was, but at a certain point, there was a large immigration of Viennese brewers to Mexico, and they were making the Vienna lagers that they were familiar with making. So in the BJCP guidelines, if it's not in the 2008, I'm almost positive it's in the 2015. In the history, it specifically addresses things like Negro Modelo being a Vienna lager. So yes, again, as a brewer, you can call your beer whatever you would like. And the BJCP can also, the people who decide the BJCP guidelines they know what they're doing, but it's at the end of the day, it's a bunch of dudes sitting around agreeing on what beer styles should be. And, there's a couple of different examples of that where something might be listed as one thing. For instance, Shinerbach is classified in the BJCP guidelines as an international amber lager, which makes far more sense than it actually being a Bach, but it's still kind of misleading. But a lot of Mexican amber lagers are properly classified, or can be properly classified, as a Vienna lager because of that Viennese brewer immigration that happened. Let me see. It is my understanding that all beers are ale yeast that are top fermenting yeast that is fermented cooler. Yes, that is. I apologize if I said that backwards. Sheena, you are absolutely correct. So an alt beer has an ale yeast fermentation that is fermented at lager temperatures, whereas a California common is a lager yeast that's fermented at ale temperatures. So again, like, you're kind of starting to get some overlap in those temperatures. But yes, you are absolutely correct. Alt beers are an ale yeast fermentation. So ale yeast is going to be top fermenting, but it's going to be fermented at more of a lager temperature. Hopefully that explanation made sense, and I apologize if I messed that up earlier when I was talking about alt beer and California common. Okay, Enid, this is a really good question. When we talk about biscuit, is that like Pillsbury biscuits and gravy, or more like a digestive cookie? So I've heard people bring this up, and some people argue for biscuit as in like biscuits and gravy. My personal take on it is that it's going to be more like a digestive cookie. So it's more of a biscuit in the English sense. That's my opinion from tasting through beers. That's not right or wrong. But generally, I think the commonly accepted answer to that is biscuit like digestive cookie, rather than like a buttermilk biscuit. Okay, so I can see that I've got one more here. Is Keller Beer somewhat equivalent to British real ales? Yeah, I think that's a good, Sarah, that's a really insightful thing to point out, that I would say yes, in that they are both served, from the kind of their final fermentation vessel. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting, insightful thing. With something like a real ale, that's going to be cask conditioned, where your secondary fermentation happens within the serving vessel, and then it's not going to, or it's going to be served without the use of like any kind of forced carbonation. So yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't go, and I know this isn't the line that you were drawing. I wouldn't go like Keller Beer equals British real ale, or Keller Beer equals cask ale. But that is there are a lot of similarities there. And that's something I hadn't really thought about before. That's a super insightful thing to point out. Okay, so this was a kind of a short one. But as we've been kind of, like I said, going hams on a lot of the lager stuff for the last few weeks, trying to figure out how to slot everything in and make sure we got it all covered was super important. So this week is going to be a little bit shorter of a week. Next week, we are back to talk about strong European beers, and that's really going to round us out in terms of kind of the not all of the lagers. We'll still have a couple more lagers to talk about in the future, but kind of leaving the German, I almost said the German continent. I promise you all, I know basic geography, but kind of leaving Germany behind. And like I said, I will have more information for you on how to submit questions for our review in a couple of weeks. And I also apologize. I don't remember if I said this at the beginning or not, but when we do that review, rather than do it via Zoom webinar, we're just going to do it via a regular Zoom. So that way we can see each other and we can talk to each other and we can have discussions and ask questions. So just as an FYI, the login information for the reviews is going to be a little bit different than for the webinars. So if you all have any questions throughout the week, please feel free to reach out and let me know. You can email me, Janet@thegymfluence.beer. You can fill out that submit a question form. Either way, they both end up in the same place. So I'm happy to receive your questions, however it's easiest for you to send them to me. The notes versions of these slides are already uploaded to the Beer Judge resources page at the very bottom. And we will have this actual presentation and the audio file and the video up probably by Wednesday of this week. So I hope all of you all had fun learning about amber European lagers, both malty and bitter tonight.